You've noticed it happened to someone you knew. Maybe it was a friend, someone who used to be present, responsive, engaged, someone who showed up at every gathering, answered every message, participated in every group conversation. And then, gradually, they weren't. The messages slowed. The appearances stopped. The person you used to know seemed to pull back from the world in a way you couldn't explain and they couldn't quite articulate. They weren't angry. They weren't ill. They hadn't moved away. They were simply gone, present somewhere you couldn't reach, occupied with something you couldn't see. Or maybe it's happening to you right now. Maybe you're the one who has started cancelling plans without fully understanding why. The one who finds social situations that used to feel normal now feel like wearing clothing 3 sizes too small. The one who has started protecting your time and your energy with an urgency that surprises even you. The one who, in quiet, honest moments, notices that the world outside has started to feel less real than the world you're building inside. If that's you, then this is the most important thing you might hear today. Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact phenomenon. He watched it unfold in person after person, some of his most psychologically developed patients, some of the most profound thinkers he encountered across decades of clinical work. And what he discovered about this disappearance was not what the people left behind assumed. It wasn't depression. It wasn't social failure. It wasn't a breakdown, a falling apart, a closing off from life. It was, in Jung's precise clinical observation, the opposite. It was the most concentrated period of interior growth a human being can undergo. And it required, without exception, a withdrawal from the social world so significant that to everyone watching from the outside, it looked like someone leaving. But to the person inside it, it felt like someone finally arriving. This video is about that arrival, what it is, why it happens, why it has to happen, and what emerges on the other side that makes every confused friend, every unanswered message, every missed gathering worth what they cost. But before we go further, stop this video right now and write something in the comments. Think of a time in your life when you needed to pull away from everyone. Not because something went wrong, because something was happening inside you that needed silence to complete itself. Just one sentence about what that felt like, because the answers in that thread are going to show you something Jung discovered that almost no one understands about their own interior life. To understand why the most psychologically developed people disappear, you first have to understand what Jung meant when he talked about the energy of the psyche. Jung observed that the human psyche operates on a principle he called libidinal economy, not libido in Freud's narrow sexual sense, but psychic energy in its broadest form, the force that drives attention, motivation, interest, engagement, the energy that makes you care about what you care about. And this energy, Jung found, is not unlimited. It is not infinitely distributable. Every investment of psychic energy in one direction requires a withdrawal from another. The person who is genuinely creating, deeply, genuinely, at the level of real psychological work, cannot simultaneously maintain the same level of social output they maintained when they were coasting on the surface of their own life. This is not a personal failing. It is not introversion, though introverts experience it more readily. It is not social anxiety or depression or any of the other diagnoses that get applied to people going through this phase. It is simple, biological, psychological mathematics. Deep interior work requires energy. Social engagement requires energy. And when the interior work reaches a critical intensity, when the psyche is undergoing genuine restructuring rather than surface maintenance, the energy gets automatically redirected inward, not by conscious choice, by psychological necessity. Jung called this the introversion of libido. Not personality introversion, though the two often coincide, but the turning of psychic energy away from the external world and toward the internal one during periods of significant transformation. And he observed something else, something crucial, something that distinguishes this state from depression or burnout. or any other kind of withdrawal that might look similar from the outside. In genuine libidinal introversion, the person is not empty. They are full. Exceptionally, almost uncomfortably full. The energy that used to animate their social life, their external ambitions, their engagement with the world outside is still there. It has simply changed direction. It is flowing inward rather than outward. And inward, it is doing work that the most important work of a human life. There is a specific sequence Jung documented across dozens of patients undergoing this process that is worth understanding in detail, because if you're in the middle of it, knowing the sequence can transform it from something terrifying into something navigable. It begins not with withdrawal, but with saturation. Something in the person's exterior life reaches a point of exhaustion, not exhaustion of effort. They may be performing brilliantly by external measures, not exhaustion of relationship. They may be surrounded by people who love them, a more specific exhaustion. The exhaustion of performing a self that has been constructed for the world rather than discovered through the self. This performance has been running in most cases for decades. The careful calibration of how much to reveal and to whom, the continuous management of how you are perceived, the slow erosion of the interior life in favor of the exterior presentation. And then, one day, not dramatically, not through a single event, but through a slow and irreversible accumulation, the performance runs out of energy to sustain itself. The social world that once felt stimulating begins to feel like noise. The conversations that once felt connecting begin to feel like exchange of surfaces. The gatherings that once felt belonging begin to feel like elaborate theater in which everyone has a role, and no one is speaking from the place in themselves that actually matters. Jung called this moment the exhaustion of the persona, and he found it was almost always the trigger for the withdrawal. The person doesn't consciously decide to pull away from the world. The world simply stops providing what the persona needs to maintain itself. And without the persona's energy, the social engagement that relied on it begins to feel impossible to sustain. What happens next is where Jung's observations become most significant. When the energy withdraws from the persona and turns inward, it encounters what Jung called the unconscious, the vast interior territory that has been accumulating material throughout the person's entire life. Everything they have felt and not expressed. Everything they have known and not acknowledged. Every part of themselves that the performance of the persona required them to suppress, redirect, or deny. This material doesn't disappear when it's suppressed. It accumulates in the unconscious, gaining pressure over years. And when the psychic energy that has been holding it in place is suddenly redirected inward rather than outward, the pressure increases dramatically. The interior becomes loud. Dreams intensify. Memories surface that haven't been visited in decades. Emotions appear with a force and specificity that the person can't quite connect to any present circumstance. Old wounds announce themselves as though they've been waiting patiently for exactly this moment, for the moment when the exterior performance finally quieted enough for them to be heard. This is why the beginning of the withdrawal is often the most disorienting part. The person expected, perhaps, a restful solitude, a quiet retreat. What they got instead is the experience of walking into a house that has been locked for years and finding it full of inhabitants. Voices, memories, feelings, images, all speaking at once. Jung was precise about what this experience is. Not breakdown, not mental illness, not a sign that the person has become too sensitive or too isolated or too disconnected from reality. It is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the process by which a person encounters the totality of who they are, not just the curated, presented self that the world has seen, and begins, for the first time, to integrate it into a whole. And this process cannot happen in the noise. It cannot happen in the continuous social engagement of a person who has never stopped performing long enough to discover what they're performing over. It can only happen in the silence, in the withdrawal, in the disappearance that looks, from the outside, like something going wrong. Jung identified several specific things that become possible in the solitude of this withdrawal, that are impossible in sustained social engagement. Understanding them explains why this disappearance is not something to be worried about, but something to be recognized as one of the most significant events in a person's psychological development. The first is what Jung called shadow integration. The shadow is the totality of what a person has been unable to accept about themselves. Not evil, not darkness in any moral sense, simply the parts of the psyche that were incompatible with the persona and therefore driven underground. The anger that was too frightening to own. The grief that was too consuming to acknowledge. The ambition that felt too selfish to admit. The capacity for cruelty or selfishness or jealousy that the constructed self refused to include. In social engagement, shadow material almost always gets projected. The person who hasn't acknowledged their own anger sees rage in others. The person who has denied their own envy perceives jealousy everywhere around them. The person who refuses to own their capacity for judgment becomes consumed with being judged. The shadow doesn't disappear when it's unacknowledged. It gets distributed, projected onto the world, seen in everyone else while remaining invisible in the self. In genuine solitude, the projection withdraws. There is no one to project onto. And the material that has been living outside, in other people's perceived behavior, in the irritants and triggers and inexplicable intensities of social life, comes home, returns to its actual location, which is inside. This is deeply uncomfortable. Meeting your own shadow directly, without the buffer of projection, without the social noise that keeps it at a distance, is one of the most demanding interior experiences a person can undergo. But it is also, Jung observed, the experience that produces more genuine psychological growth than almost anything else. Because every quality that is integrated from the shadow, every piece of denied material that is finally acknowledged, examined, and accepted as part of the self, becomes available as conscious capacity rather than unconscious compulsion. The person who integrates their anger gains the ability to act from clear, grounded assertion rather than erupting unpredictably. The person who integrates their grief gains access to the depth of feeling that was always there but never safe to approach. The person who integrates their shadow in all its complexity becomes not darker but larger, more human, more whole, more capable of genuine compassion because they have stopped needing to see the darkness only in others. There is something else Jung observed about shadow integration that is rarely discussed but critically important to understand. The shadow does not only contain what the person refused to acknowledge about themselves, it also contains what the world refused to acknowledge about them. Every quality that was punished in childhood, the intensity that was called too much, the sensitivity that was called weakness, the anger that was called dangerous, the wildness that was called inappropriate. Every quality that didn't fit the requirements of the person's environment was driven into the shadow alongside the qualities they chose to deny. This means the shadow contains not just the darkness, but enormous amounts of unlived potential, the creativity that was never given room to develop, the depth of feeling that was consistently told it was excessive, the particular gifts that were incompatible with the social environment in which the person was formed. Shadow integration in genuine solitude, therefore, is not only an encounter with what was frightening, it is an encounter with what was stolen, with the parts of the self that were exiled, not because they were destructive, but because they were inconvenient, too large, too real, too much for the environments that shaped the person to contain. The recovery of these exile qualities is one of the most significant events in a human life, and it almost always happens in exactly the kind of withdrawal we are describing, in the quiet, in the disappearance, in the space that looks empty from outside but is full of the most important returning. The second thing that becomes possible in the withdrawal is what Jung called the encounter with the self. Jung distinguished carefully between the ego, the conscious identity, the I that navigates daily life, and what he called the self. The self is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together, the organizing center, the deeper intelligence that has been shaping the person's life according to a blueprint the ego has never consciously seen. In ordinary social life, the ego dominates. It manages, performs, navigates, presents. The self's communications, arriving through dreams, through intuitions, through the persistent sense of meaning or its absence, tend to get drowned in the noise of daily engagement. The ego is too busy running the show to listen. In genuine withdrawal, the ego quiets. Not by choice, by exhaustion. The performance that sustained it has run dry. And in that quieting, the self begins to speak in ways that can finally be heard. This is the experience many people in this withdrawal describe as the most significant of their lives. A quality of interior knowing that they haven't accessed before. A sense of direction that comes not from planning or analysis, but from something deeper. A clarity about what matters and what doesn't, that couldn't be manufactured, but arrives in the silence, like something that was always there, waiting to be heard. Jung called this the transcendent function, the bridge between the ego and the self that only becomes available when the ego stops monopolizing consciousness. And he found it was almost always activated by exactly the kind of withdrawal we're describing. The disappearance, the solitude, the turning inward. There is something else happening during this withdrawal that almost no one discusses, and it is perhaps the most important thing Jung observed about this entire process. The person is not just integrating the past, they are gestating the future. Jung studied human creativity with the same rigor he brought to clinical psychology, and he found that the periods of most significant creative and psychological development in his patients' lives were almost always preceded by periods of apparent inactivity, withdrawal, retreat, the disappearance, not because the person was resting, because they were incubating. The word incubation comes from the Latin for lying down on, the practice in ancient temples of sleeping on sacred ground to receive visions. The ancients understood something that modern productivity culture has almost entirely lost, that the most important growth happens in the dark, underground, in the quiet phase between one form and another. A seed doesn't push through the soil by trying harder. It pushes through by completing the interior process that the soil, the darkness, the moisture allow it to complete. The effort comes later. The interior work, the transformation of what was into what will be, happens in the silence. The people who disappear during this phase are doing the same thing. They are not withdrawing from life. They are in the most concentrated phase of life that is possible. The interior life, the psychic life, the life that produces the person who will eventually re-emerge. And the person who re-emerges will be different in ways that can't be planned, predicted, or produced through any amount of social engagement or external activity. Jung documented this consistently. The patients who underwent genuine withdrawal and allowed the interior process to complete emerged with qualities that had been entirely absent before. A groundedness that didn't depend on external validation. A clarity about their actual values that replaced the borrowed values they'd been living by. A capacity for genuine contact with other people that the persona had always prevented. And a creativity, whether artistic or intellectual or relational, that was more original, more authentic, and more powerful than anything they had produced from behind the mask of their social self. The disappearance was not a failure. It was the condition of the emergence. But here is what Jung found most important to communicate to people who are in this phase, and what I want to leave you with. The withdrawal is not permanent. It is not a destination. The most psychologically developed people disappear, not to remain disappeared, but to complete something that can only be completed in the silence. And when it is complete, when the shadow material has been encountered, when the self has been heard, when the incubation has done its essential work, something shifts. The pull toward re-engagement begins. Not the old pull, not the compulsion of the persona to perform and be seen, not the addiction to social stimulation that had been mistaken for genuine connection. A different pull, quieter, more specific. The pull of someone who has found what they were actually looking for and can now bring it into contact with the world. The person who re-emerges from genuine withdrawal is not the same as the person who disappeared. They are more present, paradoxically, because they have less to hide. More genuinely connected, paradoxically, because they have stopped confusing performance with connection. More alive to what is real in their encounters with other people, because they have spent time in genuine encounter with themselves. Jung found that these people, after completing the withdrawal, attracted a completely different quality of relationship. Not more relationships, not more popular or more socially visible, but relationships of a depth and authenticity that had been entirely unavailable to the persona-based social life they had lived before. Because authenticity finds authenticity. The person who has gone all the way into themselves, who has met their shadow and integrated it, who has listened to the self and begun to live from it, emanates something that the persona never could. A quality of genuine presence, an absence of the subtle performance that most social interaction contains. And this quality, though it is quiet and rarely dramatic, is unmistakable to anyone sensitive enough to perceive it. The friends you make after this disappearance will be different from the friends you had before. The connections you form will ask nothing of you that requires you to be less than you are. The world you re-enter will be smaller, perhaps, but it will be real in a way the old world rarely was. This is what the disappearance is moving toward. Not permanent solitude, not spiritual isolation, not the abandonment of human connection. The discovery of the self that makes genuine human connection possible for the first time. If you're in the withdrawal right now, if you're the one who has been cancelling plans, protecting your silence, feeling the pull away from a world that suddenly feels too loud and too shallow and too full of surfaces, then hear this. You are not falling apart. You are falling together. The silence you are protecting is not empty. It is full of something that needs exactly this quiet to complete itself. The world you are temporarily leaving will still be there. And when you return to it, you will bring something to it that you could not have brought before. You will bring yourself, not the performed version, not the managed, calibrated, socially acceptable presentation, the actual, integrated, shadow-met, self-encountered self that the disappearance was always in the service of revealing. Jung spent his life studying this process, and he returned to it again and again because he believed it was the most important thing a human being could undergo. Not the most comfortable, not the most visible or most celebrated, the most important. The most psychologically advanced people disappear because they are doing the most essential work there is. And when they come back, quieter, more grounded, less impressive and more real, the people who stayed through the waiting will understand finally what the silence was for.